You tell them I'm coming, and hell's coming with me, you hear? Hell's coming with me!
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Real Estate Realities with the Rebel Broker. My name's Robert Whitelaw, and I am the Rebel Broker. Licensed real estate broker in the state of California, member of the National Association of Realtors. But please, don't hold that against me. We are halfway through August. We are reviewing in a little bit more detail a subject we covered in last week's show. And boy, should I have taken my own advice. For those of you who have partaken of the show for a while, you know that one of my first rules is always look a little deeper than the headlines. Now, my first blush on the data for the unemployment statistics I talked about last week, it all sounded good. It felt like good news. But of course, that wasn't the whole story. So, this week we are going to discuss the whole story. Why? Why is a real estate show talking about unemployment? Because unemployed people do not buy houses. They also tend to not pay their rent. So, in terms of foundational things that I think influence real estate, being plugged into what's happening with the economy, what's happening with unemployment, I think is a critical thing for folks to be aware of. Unemployment particularly, and the kinds of employment, right? Because that part-time job probably isn't going to qualify you to get that home loan. Except in the most affordable markets. So let's take a look. We're going to go, and so before we get into it, let me also let everyone know that for the first time ever, we are actually doing a video podcast. So at the same time you're listening to this on the usual weekly podcast feed that you get from Apple, iTunes, and Google, and Audible, and everywhere else, I'm also recording video while I'm doing this show. So that will be posted to YouTube, and I'll include it with the show notes for today's show, if you prefer, for some strange reason, staring deeply into my eyes as I speak. Now, I'm going to warn you, I am not a pretty man, and I didn't shave this weekend, so I'm looking a bit grubby, but we will be scrolling through this article together. So if that is something that floats your boat, I've had a few people ask to have not just an audio-only version on YouTube, but to get video. While consuming Joe Rogan, Joe Rogan's a handsome guy. He's a good-looking fella. Just couldn't see any compelling reasons to put this ugly mug up in front of everyone. But hey, I aim to please. For those of you who are drawn to the grubbier, uglier segment of society, I'm here for you. So feel free to head on over to YouTube if you'd rather consume this via a video. And of course, the payoff is less. I get to see Robert, and more, I get to see the article he's talking about. So let's take it for that. So we're going to go ahead and jump in and look at this bad boy. And you'll still get to see my lovely mug in the lower corner. But let's talk about this because it's a little bit disturbing. Now, as we all know, there was a lot of positive buzz about the unemployment numbers, a big jump, over 500,000 jump. Well, the bad news is that's not really the whole story. And I wish it was. I honestly do. I mean, we could really use a ray of sunshine in this market. But here's an article from Forbes, written by Jack Kelly, senior contributor, on August 9th. And I really wish I had seen this. Well, I guess I couldn't have seen it because he wrote it after my last show. But let's go ahead and jump into this because there's some great stats in here. Now, let's go ahead and start with the good news. Friday's report from the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics, both sides of the aisle were amazed at the creation of 528,000 new jobs. So let's also be clear about the term creation. Government doesn't create jobs. I'm never really sure why they take credit for that. They can make it hard or easy for business to hire people, but they don't create jobs. They just affect the environment in which businesses hire and fire people, right? So for those of you who've listened to me to a long time, I'm much more of a get out of the way guy when it comes to government involvement in businesses. I'd love to see fewer cozy relationships. I don't think businesses should get bailed out. There is no such thing as too big to fail. The bigger a thing is that fails, the greater the feeding will be to the small businesses around it, right? If some big name company, some auto manufacturer, right? That seems to be the go-to bailout, right? Those assets aren't going to just disappear. Other car companies would likely spring from the ashes of that. So anyway, I realize that's a side thing, and I'm sure a few of you disagree with me. But the punchline version is I dislike too much collusion between government and businesses. It tends to kill innovation and stop smaller guys from jumping in and competing. And that's another conversation we can have, but it's not a real estate conversation, so let's stick to this. Sorry. Everyone knows I always get drawn to the shiny thing. Unemployment fell to 3.5%, reverting to its pre-COVID low, which was a 50-year low. But even that number, I love how all of this is at the front of the article. We're going to get into more here in a second. Job growth was strong across almost all sectors. Payrolls skyrocketed by 22 million over the past 27 months. Private sector saw growth with 629,000 positions above their pre-pandemic peak in February of 2020. So we've quote unquote recovered all the jobs lost in the pandemic. Here's the worrisome parts, of course, in the end of the article. White-collar, full-time jobs were down by 71,000 over the month. So we lost full-time, white-collar jobs. Voluntary and involuntary part-time workers increased by 384,000. The most significant contributions to job growth were frontline and part-time workers. Many of these folks preferred full-time roles. However, they were unable to obtain those positions. People were also pushed into part-time jobs because their hours were cut back. Now, none of that should make you happy. None of that should sound encouraging to you. Because if you want a robust economy where folks are jumping in and making things happen and doing the things that make an economy work, you want more full-time white-collar jobs. So unfortunately, this is almost a complete repeat of a conversation that we had on this show in the early 2000 teens, where the exact same thing was being trotted out in terms of, look at these great unemployment numbers, but then when you looked deeper into it, you discovered first, you weren't getting the kind of jobs you needed to feed a recovery. Part-time jobs do not feed a recovery. Most of these jobs are going to end up being seasonal and just organically are going to go away once we get into winter. So that's about point one. Point two, as things continue to get bad recession-wise and inflation-wise, and companies start to tighten belts, these are the first folks that are going to get it cut. Unless they're going to cut a part-time person, or a full-time person, and replace it with 2 lower-paid part-time people, right? So that's a concern. So there is no good news in this other than at least more people are employed. But next comes the really ugly part that even argues against that. Because remember, we have a little thing called participation rate. And before we hit participation rate, one other thing I wanted to hit on here. 92,000 more Americans are working multiple jobs. 279,000 fewer people self-employed. So self-employment dropped by 279,000. And there are 623,000 fewer people in the workforce compared with February 2020. So let that sink in. 623,000 fewer people. So in terms of the number of people you even count when you're coming up with this unemployment rate, this percentage, that overall number is shrunk, which in my opinion just artificially gives you a better unemployment number. Because now we see, because that's defined by the participation rate. So you had 623,000 fewer people participating in the workforce. Now, participation rate is a metric used to determine the percentage of Americans working or seeking a new job. So it makes this assumption that someone who has stopped looking for a job or for whatever reason isn't, suddenly is not participating, so they don't get counted in the workforce as an unemployed person. Right? Now, for my money, the number should simply be any able-bodied person who is unemployed would be unemployed. They would be counted. The formula calculates the rate by taking the number of people aged 16 and older who are gainfully employed or actively seeking employment. That's the important part of that. Actively seeking employment. So for folks who've given up, they're not counted. Then dividing it by the total working age population. The opting out of the labor force is attributed to baby boomers retiring, net immigration declining, and concerns over COVID-19. All of these factors contributed to an estimated 2 million to 4 million, and that's a big range, right? One number is double the other number. So 2 to 4 million Americans staying out of the market, bringing down the participation rate. According to Layoffs FYI, 65,962 employees were laid off in the tech startup space. LinkedIn reported that dozens of top companies across the many sectors have enacted layoffs. Now, my ground truth, my anecdotal experience absolutely backs this up. In terms of tech jobs, that is a huge chunk of the folks I talk to. I mean, I work right in Silicon Valley. So layoffs, hiring freezes. I've got folks currently working with me right now. You know, I'll have conversations with my clients, with my buyers, with my sellers. What's going on where you work? What's sort of the vibe? What's the confidence level at? Some places are having hiring freezes or are not converting contractors to permanent, for instance. These are all things they're doing, unless, I guess, there's a huge savings. So I'm not sure what the mathematical process is that does that, but there's a slowdown in committing to long-term employment of people and to only wanting to move forward with net gain to the company changes to the status of someone working if it saves them money. And they're pulling away open recs for jobs that had been open for a while. It goes on to suggest that the job market is moving toward part-time work. That's simply reflected by the numbers, with the huge jump in part-time work that folks are taking on. And that isn't something, we looking at this from a real estate perspective, if we're worried about whether or not people are going to be able to be buyers, and at the price point and interest rate we're currently seeing, That's not going to happen with part-time workers. So there are an awful lot of pundits that I know I've heard talking about this is a great turning point, etc. I don't see it as a positive turning point. If anything, it's a negative turning point, because these are not jobs where people build careers out of them. These are not jobs where people buy houses because of what they earn in them. It also shows a dramatic decrease in entrepreneurhood because you don't have as many self-employed people, a huge drop, over 600,000 person drop, which indicates two things. One, failing businesses, failing small businesses, and a lack of people starting new businesses. And whether we want to believe it or not, those are where the jobs get made, right? We like to talk about the super big, everybody knows the name companies, but really the bulk of the jobs come from the entrepreneurship that comes from people starting new companies. And we're just not seeing that. According to this article from Forbes, the irony of a hot job market is that Fed Chair Jerome Powell views it as fanning the flames of inflation. Since his mandate is to lower inflation, Powell needs to substantially cool down the economy. This will be accomplished by raising interest rates. The intended consequence is that the companies will need to cut costs, which includes conducting layoffs and hiring freezes. Now, the only ray of sunshine in this is that in today's reality, while in a normal market, layoffs and hiring freezes are the go-to, any companies that have big real estate holdings will also find that they can shift their workforce to working from home, which many companies have now proven can be done, although they were forced to realize it can be done during the COVID lockdown. And I think that that will soften layoffs and hiring freezes, or at least layoffs. According to Forbes, the good news is that there seems to continue to be an almost insatiable need for talent by companies across the board. This bodes well for job seekers. Doesn't bode well for folks who want full-time white-collar jobs. There should be plenty of jobs available until Powell aggressively ratchets up interest rates. As inflation remains stubbornly high, it will continue to impact the lower-wage workers who will involuntarily need to take 2 or more part-time jobs to stay afloat. So there we have it. It is far less of a happy place that we find ourselves. And of course, having the real, honest information is what anyone who wants to make smart decisions in anything, particularly in this case, real estate, need to have. And I hope we've provided that. I realize it's a bit of a downer. What we need to see is an increase in those full-time jobs, because if we want to feed a strong real estate market, those are the jobs that we're going to need. So as always, the goal is to leave you with more information on the table than we take up in your time. I sure hope we've accomplished that. We've, I think, given you some really interesting things to think about. If you have any other thoughts, opinions, or things to share relating to this information, I'd love to hear it. Please feel free to reach out. Now, you can find me at robert@soldbyrobert.com. Just click Contact Robert, and you'll be able to send a message to me right away. From there, if you'd like to get an instant value on your home, you can do that. Just enter your address, and the process will be started for you to get that free online instant valuation of your property. If you'd prefer to start your search for your new home, you can do it right there too, right on the front page of soldbyrobert.com. Whichever need you have, we can get you going right away. Thanks again for listening, everyone, and I look forward to talking to you next time.